Hello, everyone. Welcome to Nursing Grand Rounds. While you're finishing getting your lunch, we will start our presentation so that everyone can get back on time. Today we have Marty Jones, and he's going to be discussing issues surrounding documentation. So thank you, Marty, for coming.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Looks like if you put the word legal into a presentation, you get the big crowd. So today what we wanted to do is we wanted to talk a little bit about documentation and what does that mean from both a regulatory, a legal, and a reimbursement standpoint. So first, just a real quick overview. When we talk about litigation or lawsuits, we talk about some common allegations that we see in most of these suits. First of all, we see the failure to maintain safety, and that's to maintain the patient's safety. Second, we see improper technique or treatment. The third, we see failure to monitor and report patient conditions. So either we failed to monitor their condition or we were monitoring their condition and we failed to report maybe an identified issue or risk with the patient and we did not report that up to maybe, say, the physician. Also, medication errors, failure to follow our own policies and procedures, and this is a big one, and we'll talk a little bit about this as we move through. Improper use of equipment. And that means if we take equipment and we alter it out of the manufacturer's recommendations, that can cause us some issues. And last, we have poor documentation, and that's what we're going to talk about first here. So why is documentation important? Documentation is important because it's used as the communication tool. Also, the continuity of care. So if you think about a patient's record, it should really be a continuous record or a continuous story of that patient's care that they're getting here at the hospital. Also from a quality management side, when we look at collecting data, when we look at trying to find trends, it's very important that we have the documentation in the record so we can go in and look at that stuff. We can pull that stuff out. And also we can go in and look, if we have a fallout, we can go in and we can look where that fallout was and maybe identify that trend to keep that from happening from other people. Reimbursement, this is a big one with all our clinical outcomes. So the documentation is getting more and more and more important when it comes to reimbursement. Also from the risk management side and the regulatory side, when we look at that, documentation is our key tool that we use either when we're in litigation or when we're looking from the regulatory issue when we have a surveyor here or when maybe there was a complaint made against the hospital. The stronger the documentation is, the easier it is to work through that. I'm going to get that one down this way to go forward. Okay. Why document more? Why is it important to document more? The results and the benefits are great from documentation. You just want to document the facts and you want to document what is happening, but it's important to do that. Sometimes some people feel like, well, I don't really need to document that because it wasn't that big a deal. But if you think of that as being the continuity of that patient's care, it could benefit that patient greatly if we have that documentation in the chart. And moving on, it's necessary to give that high quality of care. So it's hard for us to give high quality of care when we can't tell what happened the shift before us or the day before us as well. Lack of proper documentation can negatively impact the patient. We've seen this before where maybe something doesn't get taken out of the documentation when the patient's no longer receiving it, and that patient may receive an extra medication or an extra treatment that they weren't prescribed to have. Payment and future services may be declined due to lack of documentation. We talked a little bit about this, but even with all the pay for performance and all the reimbursement that now goes along with the documentation, it's getting more and more critical that the documentation is complete. And also, from the litigation side, the patient medical record is the best evidence. So when we're looking at the patient's medical record, it is our best evidence of the care that we provided to the patient. Do electronic medical records help? So this is a big question we get. I think that, you know, the jury's still kind of out on that one, whether or not the electronic medical record actually helps. Well, we know it does help in some ways. We know it helps us with date and time and signing of orders. So for years and years and years, we always were deficient during every survey when it came to dating and timing and signing of orders and entries in the chart. So the electronic documentation does take care of that. It timestamps it. It needs an electronic signature for it to move forward, so that does help with that. Helps with identification of gaps in real-time reports. So we're able to sit back and we're able to do a report, and we're able to take that report in real time. For example, we're able to do a report on restraint documentation. So if we pull the report and we see patient A has restraint documentation, then we would go in to see, does that patient have an order for restraint? And we can see in real time there's no order for those restraints. And then we can notify the nurse taking care of the patient that's missing. We can do the same with care plans. We can do the same with pain. We can do with like PCA documentation. We can do the same with any kind of documentation that's in the record. So it helps us to kind of plug those holes or those gaps as they're occurring. It's also a really good education tool because once we call you for the 14th time, you're sick of hearing from us. So then it usually will be documented a little better. May cause issues related to the ability to pull information forward. So this is one thing that from the quality side, especially from the regulatory side, that has become very difficult because a lot of the information that's pulled forward that isn't reviewed before it's pulled forward may not be accurate to what's happening at that time. So what we see sometimes, for instance, we'll see they're documenting that a patient's receiving tube feeding through a nasogastric tube. But we know that the nasogastric tube was taken out 24 hours before. But people have just continued to pull all that documentation forward, which causes issues when we have the surveyor come in and look, maybe if there's a complaint from the patient or the family, and then it looks like we've documented all the way through. Kind of makes it look a little bit sloppy. More difficult to review documentation completeness. So what we mean by that is, and I think that it's more difficult even from the bedside process, is you don't have everything in front of you as a snapshot. You don't have the big fold out anymore where you can go through and make sure that you have all your documentation there. You have to go to each screen. So it's difficult for us to get a snapshot to see was all the documentation done? Is all the documentation complete? I know there are some other triggers in there that help you with that. I know that, you know, through the status boards, you do have some triggers that help you identify when the documentation is complete. I went the wrong way again. Take time to document thoroughly. So I like this quote. It says, no matter how skilled or experienced you are, inaccurate and incomplete nursing documentation can mean serious trouble for your patients and for you if you're ever involved in a lawsuit. So no matter how skilled and experienced you are, so we all know those really great clinicians that don't like to document, and they think, I'm such a great clinician, I don't have to document. Really important that no matter how skilled you are, you really need to go in and make sure that your documentation is complete. And we put, and when dealing with licensing and regulatory bodies. So I know a lot of people here have been sitting with us when we have, especially the state comes in to review a patient's record. Either it's from a complaint or something we've reported. And then, so our policy will say that we document something, let's pick on restraints. So we document restraints, we monitor the patient every 2 hours. So we need to see some kind of documentation every 2 hours. So we go into the chart, and it's pretty easy to pull up. We can see it was done at 8, 10, 12, and then it wasn't done again until 8 o'clock that night. So you can see those big gaps in there. So really important that you make sure that your documentation is complete and thorough. Some documentation red flags. Notes that are sloppy or incomplete, inconsistent, illegible, or have gaps. Not as big of an issue anymore that we don't have handwritten notes. Although with the handwritten notes, we used to get a little bit more information, but we don't have the problems with with that sloppiness. The incompleteness is still there. I think because when we check off the boxes, we think we're done, and there are times where you do need to go in and put a note in. So that's one message that we want to make sure is really clear to everybody, that especially when somebody's status is changed, we are really looking for some kind of a narrative note to explain what happened. We've had times where a patient has been transferred to the ICU, and all we can find in there is that the doctor was called about the patient's condition, and then it says nothing else. So it really needs to be in there to kind of talk about that transition that the patient made as they were deteriorating. So these reflect poorly on the nurse and undermine the nurse's credibility in front of a jury. So what that means is, if you have a really sloppy or incomplete documentation, it's hard to get that jury back to say, yeah, I'm a really good nurse, and I'm a credible nurse, and I know what I'm doing, because they have this perception that there's a little bit of sloppiness there. Entries that aren't timed and dated, or they appear to be out of sequence. So we get this question a lot about late entries. So what is a late entry? What if I document something that happened 6 hours ago, 8 hours ago? So what we generally do is, if you can document while you're still on your shift, it's not truly a late entry. So if you leave your shift and come back, it's probably a late entry, and we can help you with that as well. If you ever have a question of how do I do this as a late entry? Some people will say, maybe we become aware of something and it's 4, 5, 6, 7 days later. People don't want to go in and document because they're afraid it's going to look bad. Well, really the key is, the number one concern is we want to make sure we have a complete record for the patient. So that's going to be a record that people are going to be looking at down the line. And we want to make sure that it's accurate. So our number one goal is to make sure that we make the patient's medical record accurate. And then the other thing we want to do is make sure we document what we did. So if we did it, we want to make sure we documented it. Does it look bad if we documented after we got the complaint from the patient? Yeah, sometimes that looks bad, but the important thing is that we get that in there, especially for that continuity of care and the safety for that patient. Entries that indicate delays or failures in initiating treatment orders, like we talked about, those can be red flags. Entries that show the care provided was substandard or inappropriate. So sometimes we're all our own worst enemy when it comes to documenting. We want to make sure we just document facts. We don't want to document opinions. We don't want to give our opinion on the clinician's plan of treatment. We want to make sure that we take care of that outside of the medical record. Entries that show care rendered that wasn't supported by the health care provider's prescription. So what does that mean? That means not following the doctor's order or doing something without an order. These are pretty big ones. Doesn't happen often, but it does. It does happen where someone has the intention of getting the order, or they get the order from the physician, but then when they do the treatment and they go back, they forget to put the order in. So you got to make sure that you do that. And also make sure that you follow the doctor's order. So that's another one that we get caught up in, especially from the regulatory side, is that we don't follow the doctor's order as it is prescribed. And if we're not going to follow it, because there's sometimes where it needs to be revised a little bit, we got to make sure that we document those reasons why. We talked about unexplained late entries, lack of documentation of patient education or discharge instructions. So what does this mean? Is one of the big things they find is that our policy says is that we educate patients and we give them the discharge instructions. These are requirements from all of our regulatory bodies that we do this, and we find that, especially with the education, that it's not being documented in the record. This stuff is getting a lot better, but still we are seeing these as some issues. Entries made with different ink or pen in the record if the record is handwritten. So we've seen in the middle of orders where the handwriting changes, or there's handwriting at the bottom of an order that's already put in. So what that says really to a surveyor is that somebody else went in and added this. So we want to make sure that we're careful about that. And if a practitioner is adding something to their orders, we want to make sure that they at least initial or sign that entry. Kind of as a rule of thumb, when it comes to a physician order, that's a handwritten order, we never want you to go above that physician's signature once that is signed and add anything to that order. So once that doctor signs that order, We don't want anything added by anybody but other than the physician to that order. The statement completed an event report. This can serve as a red flag that something went wrong during the patient's care. So what happens when we have an incident that occurs? We have an incident reporting system. Sometimes people will want to put in the record that they completed the event report. We don't want the event report put into the patient's medical record because event reports are protected from discovery in litigation, but the patient's record's not. So if we put in the patient's record that we completed this, you may have a plaintiff's or a patient's attorney try to go in and get that, saying now it's linked to that patient's medical record. So we just ask that you don't put it in there. We also ask that you don't put your consultations with risk management in there for the same reasons. A lot of things in risk management are protected, and once we get into the patient's record that we had a consult and that risk management gave you some advice, they'll try to get everything out of risk management that would normally be protected. There are going to be times where you want to put that in there, and there's going to be times where we say go ahead and do it, but consult with us before you do that. And you can always do an incident report, and you can put whatever you want in that incident report as far as your consultation with risk management. So when you do document, what we ask is that you should be concise, factual, accurate, and objective. So you want to make sure you document what you hear, see, smell, touch. So one of the examples we've given for years is you hear that splat in the middle of the night. And so we know what that is. We know that's usually the patient hitting the floor. So would we document that the patient fell out of bed? No, because we don't know the patient fell out of bed. We would document just the facts. We heard the noise, we went in the room, the patient was on the floor. You could put the patient stated, I was trying to get up to do what? Go to the bathroom, right? Always go to the bathroom. So you can put that, but I suggest if you're putting something that's stated, make sure that you put it into quotes. Avoid your opinions and speculation. We do see this sometimes. We get people's opinions. Notification of the physician. Make sure you notify the physician. Most of our policies, when something happens, requires that the physician be notified, whether it's the patient fell, whether it's something that requires an order. We need to document that we notify the physician. Notify the time, the content, and the response. So really important. One thing we run into is not being able to get a hold of the physician, and how do we document that? How do we document in the medical record when we can't get a hold of the physician? So a lot of people will, not a lot of people, but we've seen sometimes where it gets very creative what they want to write about why the physician's not calling back. So we want to be careful about that. This is the patient's record. So what we would suggest is that you just put the date and the time that you called the physician, and then you're waiting for the call back. And then 15 minutes later, if you call again, just put the date and the time that you're still waiting to call back. So what we like to say in orientation, especially to the new graduates, is, does your duty end when that doctor doesn't call you back for the third time? Does that mean, well, I tried to call the doctor, there's nothing I can do? No. You need to go up your chain of command when that's happening. So what can happen, a lot of things can happen. You can get either your manager involved, the health supervisor involved, and what they can do is call the medical staff or the chair of that department. We're having a hard time getting a hold of this physician. We need some orders. This patient's in pain, whatever the reason may be. And then kind of miraculously, that doctor will call you back. So they have some kind of bat phone or something that they use to let each other know, hey, they're looking for you. So make sure you go up your chain of command, and our duty doesn't end with just trying to make that call to the physician. Okay, these are some common documentation findings. Are those on your outline? Yeah. Okay, so these are some of the things, and these are things that we see, mainly from the regulatory side, but that really is because our regulatory bodies in here at least 4 or 5 times a month, going through charts and finding anything that's missing in that chart. So the first one, failure to document interventions according to the orders. It's probably the biggest one that we have. is, the physician may order an intervention that's required to do every 4 hours. Maybe it's to flush the nasogastric tube every 4 hours. And what we see is it's done once a shift. So it's just that failure to document the interventions according to the orders. A lot of times when we go back to people, they go, oh yeah, I did it every 4 hours, and they get it documented. So you need to make sure that that documentation gets in there. We'll talk about that in just a second here. Failure to follow assessment times, another big one. So like our biggest ones here are pain and restraints, things that require timed assessments. So if we have every 2-hour assessments, every 4-hour assessments, one of the issues is that we're seeing is that people, some either as registry staff or it might be staff that float, there may be different requirements on different units as far as like for the assessment. So in DSU, you might have every 4-hour assessments that are done. But on pulmonary renal, you may have every 8-hour assessments are done. So the staff needs to know where they're working, and they need to know when the assessment times are. Failure to document pain levels and responses. This has been a challenge forever for us. It continues to be a challenge. The pain levels, not so much, but the responses still are a challenge to get those in there. Failure to document notifications to the physician. So one of the things, when we report something to the state, because there's a handful of things, or 2 handfuls of things, that we have to report to the state. The first thing that they do when they come in is they want to see what the physician notifies that occurred. A lot of times the physician's there, so we have to argue with them and say, well, the physician's standing right there. But we really need to see in the chart when the physician gets notified of something that occurred. Failure to accurately initiate and update the patient's plan of care or the care plan. This is getting much, much better, but still a challenge. Not only do they ding us for not having a care plan for someone, they'll also ding us if we have a care plan that the patient doesn't have that problem. So if they go back and they see, for example, we chose anxiety, but that patient didn't show that they had any anxiety during that hospital stay, they would come at us and say, why is that care plan in there? But we don't want you to focus on that as much as we want you to focus on making sure there's a care plan for every problem that's identified. So it's important that we do that. And to update, or at least to review that care plan every shift. And that's our policy, is that you do it and you review it. You either say it's ongoing, or you close it, or you revise it. Failure to document patient and family education. We talked about this a little bit. This is a big one. Once again, getting much better, but still some challenges around getting that documentation done. Failure to document patient changes. So like I said before, sometimes we see patients get moved to the ICU, and there's not even a trail of documentation other than maybe the patient's vital signs that show us what happened with the patient and what those changes were that were going on. So make sure that you utilize the narrative or the patient's notes in order to kind of tell the story of what's going on with the patient. When you're documenting an error that occurred. So in the state of California, we're required to document unusual occurrences and errors that occur. And ultimately it falls on nursing in the California Title 22. So we can always work with you on what we should be documenting, but first, do you factually document what occurred? So we just want to tell the facts. So if we gave the patient medication A instead of medication B, we would just document patient received this medication, physician was notified. So they received this wrong medication and the physician was notified. You don't have to use the word wrong in your documentation. You just have to say, patient received medication A, physician was notified. Then under your MAR, you may document where that other medication was. It was held due to the other medication being given. So that would tell the story. Avoid language that suggests fault or blame, and we do see that sometimes. People get scared and they get defensive, and they start trying to cast blame, or whether it's the physician or whether it's the person that had the patient before them, whether it's another department, maybe the patient went down to another department and came back. So just the patient's record's not the place for that. Avoid misleading statements, so just be factual. Don't rationalize or argue your defense in the medical record. And this is a big one. It's not the place like we said, it's not the place to try to say this wouldn't have happened if they would have done what they were supposed to before they transferred the patient over to me. Document disclosures to the patient and family. So whenever we have something that occurs, an error occurs, something happens with the patient, they get the wrong medication, we make sure that we document that we disclose that to the patient and the patient's family. One of the things that our policy says is if a patient falls, we notify the family if the patient isn't alert. So we got to make sure that we're doing that, and also notifying the family when you move the patient to another level of care. So especially a higher level of care. That's another one that we've had where the family complained because they never got a call. This patient had fallen and been transferred to the ICU, and they never got a call to let them know, number one, the patient had fallen, and number two, when they came in, the patient was in the ICU. And those rarely happen, but those are some of the things that we see. Okay, wrapping up. So is it true? So two of my favorite statements are, if you didn't chart it, you didn't do it, or if you didn't chart it, it did not happen. Anybody ever hear those before? Okay, if you didn't chart it, it didn't happen. Or if you didn't chart it, you didn't do it. So does anyone think that's true? I personally don't think it's true. If you didn't chart it, you didn't do it, or if you didn't chart it, it didn't happen. So I think like a simple explanation would be, if I put an IV in you, but I don't chart it, do you not have an IV in you? You still have the IV in you, right? Why is this used, and why is it important? It's important because missing documentation coupled with a poor outcome complicates the patient's defense of cases complicates the defense of cases no matter what strategy is employed, so the people defending the case. And it provides the plaintiff with an opportunity to successfully argue that care was not rendered. So they want to go back, well, if you can't even document it, how do we know you did it? How do we know that you're even giving good care if you didn't document it? So the documentation is important. We realize that the documentation is a lot, that with electronic documentation, it's taking us away from our patients more. We just want to emphasize that the basics of the documentation are important from all different aspects, but mainly from the patient safety standpoint, in continuing to tell that story of what's going on with the patient. Really important that we have accurate documentation. Any questions? Okay, thank you for coming.